What's the number one mistake that I see managers make that you won't do because you're watching this video? Well, that's managing to the lowest common denominator. In this video, I'll talk about what that means, why people do it, and what you can do to avoid doing that and be a better leader for your team. Now, managing to the lowest common denominator often means assuming the worst in people. So, let's say you have an expectation, a goal. Well, you think the way to fulfill that is having everybody on their team give daily reports so you know exactly what they're doing. So all of a sudden your team members are spending a chunk of their day, or maybe time at the end, completing these reports to talk about what they did that day instead of getting more done. So sometimes it's about productivity and monitoring productivity. Other times it's positive things like time off. And people are like, well, I'd love to give more time off, but people just take advantage of it. Or I'd love to give flexibility in people's schedules, but people will just show up at the last second or skimp out on important things. And so oftentimes what you see is requiring a lot of people, a lot of administrative things that are more about activity than actual work, or not giving good things to your team members, not giving things like trust or opportunities to develop. Like, well, I can't have them do that. They'll embarrass me in front of the leadership team. So not giving them the opportunities to actually learn. So a lot of it is about, again, requiring additional things from team members or not giving things like positive benefits or opportunities because you're afraid of what's going to happen. So that gets to the why it happens, because it is often about that fear. As a manager, you generally have a boss as well. Like even the CEO tends to report to the board of directors, shareholders, whatever. Everyone has a boss. And so in leadership, a lot of people, and maybe your team members, think that you have it all, that you have it confident and you know what you're doing. But oftentimes as you get through, whether it's imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, or just general thoughts, you have a fear of messing up and looking badly to your boss, getting in trouble with your boss, like, oh, my job's going to be at stake. And especially as a manager, when a lot of your performance depends on your team's performance, then you worry about how they're doing because you may think it's out of my control. So a lot of it is about that aspect of control. You're trying to control goals getting done in your own career. And so it can be tempting to think that the way to do that is to control those members of your team or to not give those benefits so your team focuses on work. And maybe even thinking to yourself, like, I'll give them more opportunities as they learn, or I'll give them more flexibility as they prove themselves. But rarely do you get to that point where you're giving them those things. You often are stuck within that zone of control. And why it can be such a problem is not only can it demotivate those strong performing team members. Like you may have, if you're in sales, for example, like talking about activity and saying, okay, I want daily reports for everybody. So you have a strong sales performer. Well, they're going to say, okay, now, so I'm going to spend an hour of my day that I could be reaching out, having conversations, doing sales strategy. I'm going to have that doing a report of everything I'm doing. So either I'm going to take an hour out of my day or work an hour extra out of my day to get that done. Like, ugh. So maybe you tell those team members, like, I don't mean you. Don't worry about it. You don't have to do those reports. Well, now those team members that maybe are the lowest common denominator, quote unquote, or those newer employees or those that don't have a strong performance or even have poor performance. Now those people look at your high performers and they're like, well, that's not fair. Why do I have to do this when they don't? And so now looking at your time and energy. So it's taken away from like sales strategy, even in thinking about goals. You're not there. What you're doing as a manager is spending your time and energy trying to divvy up, like pacify the strong performers, but not make it too obvious because now you don't want to create drama and have those others on your team coming to you and complaining like, what's going on? And so people are frustrated. Either your strong performers all of a sudden mean like, okay, I don't have to do this, like things don't apply to me. And so you have this team of like first and second class citizens on your team. And all of it is around this aspect of control and the activity that you're putting on. And so it can demotivate your team. It can lead to decreased performance, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do. In your time and energy, you go home and you're like, when does it stop? So what can you do as a manager? Especially if it's the beginning of the year, you have goals. Well, a lot of it is breaking it down and thinking about, instead of assuming the worst in people, like, okay, we have this goal, I need to make sure people are doing exactly what they're doing and have really detailed lists of all of their activity. Talking in particular, including talking about the things that you're afraid of. Because as a manager, just like your employees may think like you have it all together, you may think to yourself, okay, I have to be that person because that's who they think I am. So I'll look weak if I say anything about like, oh, I'm not going to tell my team members I'm afraid of getting in trouble with my boss. But instead, a sign of strength as a leader and a sign that can actually build that trust to manage to all of the members of your team is to talk about that. So as you start out having goals, and I've made videos about when you have goals and how valuable it can be to include team members in goals and setting them. But right now, you may just have goals that you've been given. But so talking to your team and saying, this is what the goal looks like. If there's not an opportunity to change it, then this is what it is. I want to figure out how to get us to meet there. And even saying things like, sometimes people get this and they're like, okay, to meet this, we're going to break it down and we're going to have really specific activity. I'm going to track you against it. Because that is an option. And sometimes in things like sales, account management, there's like numbers that feed into it. But instead of starting with the process and the things like, well, I expect this out of all of the team members, giving them visibility into the broader goal and then talking to team members about what you can do. It's like if your team, for example, has $1 million goal this year, $2 million goal, saying this is what it looks like. Let's break it down. And I want to talk about what that looks like. And saying like there can be things like activity that goes in it. Or let's say you're in a call center, for example, and you've been given this expectation of we're going to take on more calls per day. And talking to your team honestly and saying, this is the goal that we've been given, but I don't just want to give you this goal and tell you to do it because the way you're going to do it is likely going to be to hang up on people and shorten those calls and do whatever it takes to meet the numbers. But so saying, as I get these, I want to figure out how we can meet them. And I want to trust and get your all's input into really delivering those for the organization. And what I don't want to do is add time to your day where you're either having to take time away from your work or take time out of your personal life to come up with like really intricate reporting to prove to me you're doing what you say you're going to do. But saying we also have to have results. And so I want to give trust and set what the expectation, what that looks like for us to meet it, and then talk about how we're going to get it done. And so building it and saying this comes from a position of trust. I don't want to be one of those managers that requires these things because a lot of your team members are likely going to have had situations in their career or have friends and family that have those bosses that do exactly this. Like just require more and don't even think twice about what that means to like the real lives of people. Again, either making them less productive by spending all this time on reports or taking time out of their personal life because now they just have to work more to get them done. And talking about other things like flexibility. Like, for example, if your team, you want it to be an 8 to 5 schedule and you're like, well, I want to give some flexibility. Some people may want to start earlier. Some people may want to start later. But you're worried like, okay, if I give an inch, they'll take a mile. But talking to your team about that and saying, I want to make sure, obviously we have work that we want to get done. And it's important that we do the work. But also I know we have different lives and needs, inside and outside of work. And so I want to find flexibility where we can. So if it means adjusting, starting and getting the work done, I trust you all to do it. And being clear, like if there's situations where we're not meeting goals, we'll talk about that because ultimately that's my job is to get work done, but also support you in your professional career, your development, but also not do that to pretend like you don't have a life outside of work. So how we can flex things a bit. Like I'm not going to be watching on the clock to see if you're here exactly at 8 a.m. if the job doesn't require it. And I'm also not going to look at you out the door if you leave at 4:59 as opposed to whatever time. But I want to really focus on things getting done. And so when I speak with you about our one-on-ones and focus on goals, I'm not going to focus on just the things that seem like start times or pure activity just out of numbers. I want to get the story behind those and make sure that we have flexibility where we can, support people where we can, and if things aren't getting done, then we'll figure it out. And if something needs adjustment, then we'll do it. But I do want to establish that culture of trust. Because doing this and having more honest conversations with your team. And if you ever need help on doing that, you can use things like a ChatGPT of like, okay, how do I avoid managing the lowest common denominator of employees if my role is this? You can get some more specific ways to do that. But in 2025 is having conversations, establishing trust, and making sure that you're managing towards those goals and bringing the best into people. not pushing down the best on your team.